Ready, boys?
Ready, Mother.
All set.
Then let's show them it works.
They're all staring.
Let them. By the time we're home, they'll know.
How far to grandfather's?
Far enough to change everything.
Summer of 1885, Mannheim, Germany. The summer heat hung heavy over Mannheim as Karl Benz wiped the grease from his hands, staring at the contraption before him. It was an odd-looking machine, part carriage, part bicycle, wholly unprecedented. 3 wheels supported a skeletal frame, and at its heart sat something revolutionary, a single-cylinder 4-stroke engine that ran on gasoline. Karl had been working on this dream for years, pouring every spare mark and every waking hour into what many considered a fool's errand. "Karl, come to bed," his wife Bertha called from the window above the workshop. "You've been down there for 16 hours. But Karl couldn't stop. He was so close. The engine had turned over successfully just yesterday, sputtering to life with a sound that made his heart race faster than any galloping horse. This wasn't just a machine, it was the future. He could feel it in his bones. His neighbors thought otherwise. Herr Schmidt from next door had openly mocked him just last week. Benz and his noisy toy. The horses are already frightened enough without your infernal machine coughing and spitting like a demon. But Karl had supporters too, quiet ones. His wife Bertha believed in him with a fierce determination that sometimes surprised even Karl himself. She had invested her dowry into his experiments, never once complaining when another prototype failed or when they had to scrimp on household expenses so he could buy more materials. The cold January morning felt different. Karl stood outside the Imperial Patent Office, clutching the papers that described his vehicle powered by a gas engine. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. Inside the office, the clerk looked at his drawings with barely concealed skepticism. "Herr Benz, we've seen many strange inventions pass through these doors, but this, are you certain this contraption actually works?" "It does," Karl said firmly. "I call it the Benz Patent-Motorwagen. It has 3 wheels, a 954 cubic centimeter engine producing 3/4 of a horsepower, and it can reach speeds of up to 16 kilometers per hour. The clerk's eyebrows rose. 16 kilometers per hour? That's quite fast for something without a horse pulling it. When Karl walked out with his patent certificate, German patent number 37435, he felt as though he was carrying the future in his hands. The automobile was now official. It existed not just in his workshop but in the eyes of the law. He rushed home to tell Bertha, bursting through the door with uncharacteristic excitement. "We did it. The patent is registered. The motor wagon is officially recognized." Bertha embraced him, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you would succeed, Karl. I always knew." Their children, Eugen, Richard, and Clara, gathered around, wanting to see the precious document. At 15, 13, and 12 years old respectively, they had grown up watching their father's obsession, sometimes resenting the attention he gave to his machines, but now caught up in his triumph. But as weeks turned into months, Karl's euphoria began to fade into something darker: worry. He had the patent. He had the machine. He had even managed to demonstrate it to a few curious onlookers in Mannheim. But nobody was buying. Worse yet, nobody seemed to truly believe in it. The motor wagon sat in his workshop, a magnificent achievement that the world seemed determined to ignore. Karl took it out for short rides around the neighborhood, never venturing far from home. The engine was temperamental, requiring constant adjustments. The steering was tricky. And most damningly, it was so unfamiliar that people feared it more than they admired it. "It's too dangerous," said potential investors. "Why would anyone need such a thing when horses work perfectly well?" asked others. "It breaks down too often," complained those who had seen it sputter to a stop. By the summer of 1888, Karl was deeply discouraged. He sat at the dinner table one evening, pushing food around his plate, barely eating. "What if I've wasted all these years?" he said quietly. "What if the automobile is simply an idea whose time will never come?" Bertha set down her fork with a sharp clink that made everyone look up. Her eyes flashed with determination. "Karl Benz, I did not invest my inheritance, my time, and my faith in you to hear you talk like this. Your automobile works. It works beautifully. The problem isn't the machine, it's that people haven't seen what it can really do. But I've demonstrated it dozens of times. Short trips around Mannheim. Little circles in the neighborhood. Karl, people need to see it do something real, something impressive. They need to see it take a real journey." Karl looked at her skeptically. "Bertha, it's not ready for a long journey. There are too many things that could go wrong. The engine could fail. We might not find fuel. The roads are terrible outside the city. It would be foolish to attempt. But Bertha was no longer listening. An idea had taken root in her mind, and once Bertha Benz had an idea, it was as unstoppable as one of Karl's engines. Bertha woke her two older sons, Eugen and Richard, while it was still dark outside. "Get dressed quickly and quietly," she whispered. "We're going on an adventure." "What kind of adventure?" 15-year-old Eugen mumbled sleepily. "We're going to visit your grandmother in Pforzheim." Richard, now 14, sat up immediately. "That's over 100 kilometers away. How are we going to—" He stopped, his eyes widening. "Mother, no. You can't mean." "I absolutely do mean," Bertha said with a smile that was equal parts excitement and mischief. "We're taking the motor wagon." "Does father know?" Eugen asked. "Your father would never agree to this. Which is precisely why we're not going to tell him until we've already left. Now hurry." In the pre-dawn darkness, Bertha and her sons pushed the motor wagon out of the workshop and down the street, not starting the engine until they were far enough away that Karl wouldn't hear. Bertha had left a note on the kitchen table, "Gone to visit mother in Pforzheim. Back in a few days. Don't worry. B." She knew Karl would worry anyway. That was unavoidable. But by the time he found the note, they would be too far away for him to stop them. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Bertha sat in the driver's seat, her hands on the steering tiller, her sons beside her. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with that distinctive sound that had become so familiar to them. "Hold on, boys," Bertha said, her voice trembling with excitement. "We're about to make history." The motor wagon rolled out of Mannheim at a steady pace, the engine humming reliably as they left the familiar streets behind. Bertha had studied maps of the route to Pforzheim, memorizing the towns they would pass through, Weissloch, Bruxelles, and others. She had no guidebook for automobile travel. She was writing it with every turn of the wheels. The morning was beautiful, and for the first hour, everything went remarkably well. The vehicle maintained a steady speed of about 15 kilometers per hour. Farmers in the fields stopped their work to stare at the strange contraption passing by. Some waved, others made the sign of the cross as if warding off evil spirits. "Mother, this is incredible!" Eugen shouted over the engine noise. "We're really doing it." Richard was less enthusiastic, gripping his seat nervously every time they hit a bump. "Are you sure this is safe?" "Of course it's safe," Bertha replied, though truthfully she had no idea. She was making this up as she went along, trusting in Karl's engineering and her own determination. Their first crisis came near Weissloch, about 20 kilometers into the journey. The engine began to sputter and lose power, coughing like a sick patient. Bertha recognized the problem immediately. They were running out of fuel. "There's an apothecary in Weissloch," she said, steering toward the town. "We'll stop there." When they pulled up in front of the Stadtapotheke, the town pharmacy, the proprietor, Herr Willi Ockel, came running out, alarmed by the noise and smoke. "Frau Benz, what on earth is that thing?" "It's a motor wagon," Bertha explained calmly, climbing down from the vehicle. "And it runs on ligroin. Do you have any?" Ligroin was a petroleum solvent used primarily as a cleaning fluid. The apothecary stared at her as if she'd asked for something completely absurd, which in a way she had. "You want to buy cleaning solvent for that machine?" "Yes, please. As much as you can spare." Herr Ockel scratched his head but went inside to fetch his entire stock of ligroin, about 3 liters worth. He watched in amazement as Bertha carefully poured it into the motor wagon's fuel tank. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. Still dazed, he named a price. Bertha paid him and smiled. "Herr Ockel, you've just become the world's first gasoline station attendant. People will remember this someday." He had no idea what she meant, but he would indeed be remembered. That pharmacy in Weissloch would later claim the title of the world's first automobile filling station. Refueled and refreshed, they continued their journey. But the motor wagon, like any pioneering technology, was far from perfect. About 40 kilometers into the trip, near a steep hill, the engine began to strain. "It's losing power," Eugen observed. Bertha frowned, listening to the engine's labored breathing. The problem was the leather brake pads. They had worn down significantly, and the vehicle couldn't maintain enough control on the descents to safely climb the next hill. "We need to find a cobbler," she announced. "A cobbler? Why?" Richard asked. "Because cobblers work with leather, and that's what we need to repair the brake pads." In the next village, they found a confused but helpful shoemaker who, at Bertha's direction, crafted new leather brake pads from his supplies. He watched as she and Eugen installed them on the strange machine, still not entirely sure what he was looking at. "What is this contraption?" he asked. "The future," Bertha replied with a smile. The repaired brakes worked beautifully and they pressed on. But the adventure was far from over. As afternoon approached, they encountered a new problem. The ignition system was failing. The engine would fire sporadically, then die, then fire again. Bertha pulled over to investigate. After examining the engine, she identified the problem: a clogged fuel line. Without proper tools, she did something that would become legendary in automotive history. She used her hat pin to clear the blockage, carefully threading the long pin through the fuel line to dislodge the debris. "There," she said triumphantly, wiping her hands on her dress. "That should do it." Later, when the electrical ignition wire came loose, she improvised again, using one of her garters to insulate the wire and keep it in place. "Mother, you're a genius," Eugen declared. "Necessity is the mother of invention, my dear," Bertha replied. "Or in this case, the mother is the invention." They encountered a steep hill near Boschlot that proved too much for the underpowered engine. Rather than admit defeat, Bertha and her son simply got out and pushed the motorwagon to the top, then climbed back in and continued their journey. Villagers who witnessed this sight talked about it for years. The well-dressed lady and her two boys, pushing their strange smoking machine up the hillside with grim determination. As they passed through each village, word of their journey spread faster than they could travel. In an age without telephones in every home, news still traveled quickly through the German countryside. Farmers would run from their fields to neighboring villages, spreading the word: "A woman and her children are traveling in a horseless carriage," without any animal pulling it. By the time Bertha reached each new village, crowds had gathered to see the marvel. Some people cheered, others viewed the motorwagon with suspicion or fear. Horses spooked as they passed, and more than once, Bertha had to slow down or stop entirely to avoid causing an accident. At one point, a local constable tried to stop her, insisting that the motorwagon was disturbing the peace. "I'm sorry, officer," Bertha said politely but firmly, "but this vehicle is properly patented and we are breaking no laws. We're simply traveling to visit my mother. But it's frightening the horses." "Then perhaps people need to start getting their horses accustomed to progress," she replied, and drove on before he could argue further. As the day wore on, the challenges mounted. The roads, designed for horse-drawn carriages, were rutted and uneven. The motorwagon's hard wheels felt every bump and stone. Bertha's hands ached from gripping the steering tiller. Her back was sore from the constant jostling. Richard had long since stopped complaining about safety and was now fully invested in the adventure. "How much farther, Mother?" "We're more than halfway there," Bertha assured him. "We can do this." Near Durlach, the chain that drove the rear wheels began to slip. Bertha stopped again, examining the problem with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years watching her husband work. "The chain needs tightening," she announced. "Eugen, help me." Together, mother and son adjusted the chain tension, using tools they had brought along for just such emergencies. Bertha had been smart enough to pack a basic tool kit before leaving Mannheim, knowing that the motorwagon would likely need adjustments along the way. As evening approached, they were tired, dirty, and hungry, but they were almost there. Pforzheim lay just ahead, and Bertha's mother was expecting them, though she certainly wasn't expecting them to arrive in such a dramatic fashion. The sun was setting as they rolled into Pforzheim, the motorwagon's engine still running strong despite all the challenges of the day. People lined the streets to see the strange vehicle that had traveled over 100 kilometers without horses. Bertha's mother, standing in her doorway, watched the scene with a mixture of shock and pride. "Bertha, my dear girl, what have you done?" "I've proven that Karl's automobile works, Mother," Bertha said, climbing down from the driver's seat with as much dignity as she could muster despite being covered in grease and road dust. "I've proven it can take real journeys, not just short trips around town." Her mother embraced her, laughing and crying at the same time. "You always were the bold one. Come inside, all of you. You must be exhausted and starving." Back in Mannheim, Karl Benz had found Bertha's note shortly after dawn. At first, he thought she meant they had taken the train to Pforzheim, an unusual decision, perhaps, but not alarming. Then he went to his workshop and saw that the motorwagon was missing. His heart stopped. "No," he whispered. "She wouldn't. She couldn't have." But he knew his wife. Of course she would. Of course she could. Karl spent the entire day in a state of anxiety, pacing his workshop, imagining all the disasters that might befall them. The engine could fail catastrophically. They could crash. Bertha could be arrested for disturbing the peace. The motorwagon could break down in some remote location, leaving them stranded. Late that afternoon a telegram arrived safely in Pforzheim. Motorwagen performed admirably. Your wife is brilliant and brave. Mother Ringer. Karl sat down heavily, the telegram trembling in his hands. Relief washed over him, followed quickly by amazement, then pride. She had actually done it. Bertha had driven his automobile over 100 kilometers on public roads, proving definitively that it was practical, reliable, and ready for the world. 3 days later, Bertha and her sons made the return journey to Mannheim. Armed with the experience from their first trip, they were better prepared for the challenges. Bertha had identified several improvements that needed to be made, mental notes she would share with Karl. The brakes needed redesigning, the engine needed more power for hills, the fuel tank needed to be larger, and the ignition system needed to be more reliable. The return trip was easier, partly because of their experience and partly because word had spread so thoroughly that people in each village were expecting them. Some villages had even arranged for Ligroen to be available, recognizing that this strange new machine would need fuel. When they finally rolled back into Mannheim, they found Karl waiting in the street outside their home, surrounded by neighbors and curious onlookers. The moment Bertha stopped the motorwagon, Karl rushed forward. "You're insane," he said, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You could have been killed. You could have." "But we weren't," Bertha interrupted, smiling up at him. "Karl, your automobile works. Not just for short demonstrations, it works for real journeys. I've proven it beyond any doubt." Karl looked at the motorwagon, then at his wife and sons, then back at the growing crowd of spectators. Many were pointing and talking excitedly, their earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity and amazement. "What did you learn?" he asked quietly. Bertha's smile widened. "Oh, I learned so much. The brakes need improvement. I had to have them repaired along the way. The engine needs more power for steep hills. The ignition is temperamental. The fuel line needs better design. The chain drive needs adjustment. But Karl..." She squeezed his hands. "It works. Your dream works. The automobile is real and now everyone knows it." In the days and weeks that followed, news of Bertha's journey spread throughout Germany and beyond. Newspapers picked up the story, "Woman drives motorwagon over 100 kilometers." The journey captured public imagination in a way that Karl's careful demonstrations never had. Suddenly, people weren't just curious about the motorwagon, they were interested in buying one. The automobile wasn't just a mechanical novelty, it was a practical vehicle that could take real journeys. If a woman and her children could travel over 100 kilometers in it, surely it was safe and reliable enough for everyday use. Orders began to come in. Karl made the improvements Bertha had suggested, each one making the motorwagon more reliable and user-friendly. The brake pads were redesigned with better materials. The engine was upgraded to produce more power. The fuel system was improved to prevent clogs. Bertha became something of a celebrity, known as the woman who had proven the automobile's worth. She gave interviews describing the journey and the potential she saw for motorized transportation. Some men criticized her boldness, claiming it was unseemly for a woman to undertake such an adventure. But many more, both men and women, celebrated her courage and vision. "Frau Benz," a journalist asked her during one interview, "were you not frightened to undertake such a dangerous journey?" Bertha smiled. "The only thing I feared was that people would never recognize the value of my husband's invention. The journey itself? That was simply necessary. Someone had to show the world what the motorwagon could do. Who better than the inventor's wife?" Today, the route that Bertha traveled, from Mannheim to Pforzheim, is commemorated as the Bertha Benz Memorial Route. Historical markers dot the path, noting significant points along her journey: the pharmacy in Weissloch where she bought fuel, the places where she made repairs, the hills she had to push the vehicle up. The journey on August 5, 1888, is recognized as the world's first long-distance automobile trip. Bertha Benz is remembered not just as the inventor's wife, but as a pioneer in her own right. The first person to recognize that demonstrating the automobile's practical value required more than short trips around town. It required adventure, risk, and determination. Karl would later say that while he invented the automobile, Bertha invented the road trip. More importantly, she invented the public's faith in the automobile. Her journey transformed the motorwagon from an interesting curiosity into a commercial success. The Benz Patent-Motorwagen became the world's first commercially available automobile. By 1893, Karl was producing his vehicles in significant numbers. Other inventors and entrepreneurs, inspired by Benz's success, began developing their own automobiles. The age of the automobile had truly begun. And it all started with a determined woman, 2 brave sons, a 3-wheeled vehicle, and a journey that proved the future could be driven, not just dreamed. Years later, when Karl Benz was an old man, celebrated as one of the fathers of the automobile age, he was asked what he considered his greatest achievement. "The motorwagon," he said without hesitation. "But I didn't achieve it alone. My wife Bertha, she saw what it could be before anyone else did. She believed in it enough to risk everything on one bold journey. The automobile succeeded because she had the courage I lacked." Bertha, sitting beside him, patted his hand. "You had the courage to dream it, Karl? I simply had the courage to drive it." We each played our part. As the automobile industry grew and transformed the world, changing everything from how cities were designed to how wars were fought, the story of that first great journey was never forgotten. It served as a reminder that innovation requires not just invention, but also demonstration, not just engineering but also courage. The automobile wasn't born on January 29, 1886, when Karl received his patent. It wasn't even born in the summer of 1885 when he first got the engine running. The automobile was truly born on August 5, 1888, when Bertha Benz decided that the world needed to see what the future looked like, and drove it into existence 1 kilometer at a time.